The morning sun filtered through our kitchen window as I poured myself a second cup of coffee, watching my 13-year-old daughter Sophie carefully spread peanut butter on her toast. She had her father's eyes, deep brown and thoughtful, but my stubborn streak that would serve her well in life, though I didn't know just how well until that fateful evening 3 months ago. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs we missed, all the red flags we explained away because family is supposed to protect each other, not destroy each other from within. My name is Rachel, and I'm a 42-year-old mother living in a quiet suburb outside Denver, Colorado. My husband Michael and I had built what we thought was a good life here, surrounded by mountains and fresh air, raising our daughter in a community where people still knew their neighbors' names. We'd been married for 15 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs like any marriage, we were solid, united, especially when it came to protecting Sophie. Michael worked as a mechanical engineer at a local firm, often putting in long hours but always making time for Sophie's soccer games and school plays. I ran a small online boutique from home, selling handmade jewelry and accessories, which gave me the flexibility to be there for Sophie while still contributing to our household income. Sophie was our miracle baby, born after 3 years of trying and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages. Perhaps that's why we were both so protective of her, why we noticed every little change in her mood, every shift in her normally sunny disposition. She was a straight-A student, played violin in the school orchestra, and had a small group of close friends who often gathered at our house for movie nights and study sessions. She had this way of seeing the world that was both innocent and wise beyond her years, a combination that would prove to be both her strength and what nearly destroyed her that night at the wedding. The wedding belonged to Michael's nephew, Brandon, who was marrying a lovely young woman named Ashley after dating for 2 years. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Grand Mountain Resort, one of those sprawling hotels that tried to capture the essence of a Swiss chalet, but ended up looking more like a confused architectural experiment. Michael's family was large and boisterous, the kind of family that took over entire sections of restaurants and had reunions that required renting out parks. I'd learned to navigate their dynamics over the years, though I'd never quite felt like I fully belonged. There was always this underlying current of judgment, especially from Michael's older brother Daniel, who seemed to view our small family unit as somehow incomplete or lacking. Daniel was 41 years old, 3 years older than Michael, and had always been the golden child of the family. He was a successful attorney with his own practice specializing in elder law, which everyone thought was so noble, helping senior citizens with their estates and legal matters. He had this way of commanding attention when he entered a room, tall and imposing with premature grey threading through his dark hair that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old. He'd been divorced twice, both marriages ending badly according to family gossip, though no one ever spoke about the details in front of the children. His current girlfriend, Teresa, was 28 and worked as a paralegal at his firm, a detail that raised eyebrows at family gatherings, though no one dared comment directly. I should have paid more attention to how Sophie always seemed to shrink into herself whenever Daniel was around. She'd make excuses to leave the room, suddenly remembering homework or needing to call a friend. When I asked her about it once, she just shrugged and said he made her feel weird, the way he looked at people like he was calculating their worth. I dismissed it as teenage sensitivity, one of those personality clashes that happen in families. How I wish I'd listened more carefully to what she wasn't saying. The day of the wedding, Michael had been called into work for an emergency. A critical system at the plant had failed, and as the lead engineer, he couldn't delegate the repair. He'd been apologetic, knowing I dreaded attending family events without him as my buffer, but we both agreed Sophie shouldn't miss her cousin's wedding. She'd been excited about wearing the lavender dress we'd bought together, her first real formal gown that made her look so grown up it took my breath away. I'd helped her with her hair that morning, creating an elegant updo that showcased the pearl earrings my mother had given her for her 13th birthday just 2 months earlier. We arrived at the Grand Mountain Resort as the sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold that would have been breathtaking if I hadn't been so focused on navigating the crowded parking lot. Sophie chatted excitedly about seeing her cousins, especially Madison, who was 16 and had promised to teach her some new dance moves. The hotel lobby was awash in wedding guests, women in flowing dresses and men looking uncomfortable in suits they clearly didn't wear often. Michael's mother, Barbara, swooped down on us immediately, air-kissing my cheek while enveloping Sophie in a perfumed hug that left my daughter gasping for air. The ceremony itself was beautiful, held in the hotel's garden terrace with the mountains as a backdrop. Brandon looked nervous but happy, constantly tugging at his bow tie while Ashley glided down the aisle like something out of a fairy tale. Sophie sat beside me, her hand occasionally reaching for mine during the emotional parts, especially when Brandon's voice cracked while reciting his vows. I remember thinking how perfect everything looked, how this was what family celebrations should be, everyone gathered together in joy and love. The universe must have been laughing at my naivety. The reception was held in the hotel's grand ballroom, a cavernous space decorated with thousands of tiny lights that created the illusion of stars overhead. Round tables covered in ivory linens were scattered throughout the room, each centerpiece a masterwork of roses and baby's breath that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Sophie was seated at the designated kids' table with her various cousins, ranging in age from 8 to 16. I watched her settling in, laughing at something Madison whispered in her ear, before making my way to the adult table where I'd been placed between Barbara and Michael's Aunt Phyllis, a seating arrangement that promised to test my patience and small talk abilities. The dinner service had just begun when I excused myself to use the restroom. The hallways of the hotel were like a maze, all looking identical with their burgundy carpet and gold-framed paintings of mountain scenes. I'd taken a wrong turn trying to find my way back to the ballroom when I heard raised voices coming from around a corner. My steps slowed instinctively, that primitive part of the brain that signals danger even before conscious thought catches up. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering for reasons I couldn't explain, and peered around the corner. What I saw made my blood run cold. Brandon, still in his wedding finery, had one of the bridesmaids pressed against the wall. The young woman, whom I recognized as Ashley's college roommate Melissa, was crying, black mascara running down her cheeks as she tried to push Brandon away. His hands were everywhere they shouldn't be, and the look on his face was predatory, nothing like the nervous young man who'd just promised to love and cherish Ashley. I stood frozen, my mind trying to process what I was seeing, when movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. Sophie stood at the other end of the hallway, her lavender dress making her look like a lost fairy tale princess. Her eyes were wide with shock and confusion as she took in the scene before her. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw the moment her innocence shattered, replaced by a knowledge no 13-year-old should have. Brandon must have sensed our presence because he suddenly stepped back from Melissa, his face cycling through expressions of shame, anger, and finally, a cold calculation that made my skin crawl. I rushed to Sophie, pulling her against me as Melissa fled down the hallway, her sobs echoing off the walls. Brandon straightened his tie, that calculating look never leaving his face as he approached us. He didn't say anything, just stared at Sophie with an intensity that made me step in front of my daughter protectively. Then he smiled, a horrible twisting of lips that held no warmth, and walked back toward the ballroom as if nothing had happened. I should have confronted him then, should have marched into that reception and exposed him for what he was. But I was in shock, my mind still trying to process what we'd witnessed, and Sophie was trembling against me like a leaf in a storm. We returned to the ballroom, and I tried to act normal, but Sophie was visibly shaken. She picked at her food, her earlier excitement completely evaporated. I kept glancing toward the head table where Brandon sat beside Ashley, playing the part of the devoted new husband, occasionally leaning over to whisper something that made her laugh. Melissa was nowhere to be seen, her absence at the wedding party table glaringly obvious to anyone who was paying attention, though it seemed I was the only one who was. About 30 minutes later, Sophie tugged on my sleeve and whispered that she needed to tell me something important. We stepped into a quiet corner near the dessert table and she told me what she'd done. While I'd been frozen in shock, my brave daughter had found Barbara at the adults' table and quietly informed her grandmother what she'd seen in the hallway. My heart sank even as pride in Sophie's courage swelled. Barbara was notoriously protective of her family's reputation, and Brandon was her favorite grandson. This wouldn't end well. The explosion came faster than I expected. Daniel had been standing near the bar when Barbara whispered urgently in his ear. I watched his face transform from confusion to rage in seconds. He strode across the dance floor like an avenging angel, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide the violence in his movements. He grabbed Sophie's arm before I could react, yanking her to her feet with enough force to knock over her chair. Sophie cried out in pain and surprise, and I lunged forward, but Daniel was already dragging her toward the service entrance, shouting about lying brats who tried to ruin family occasions. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and terror. I ran after them, screaming for help, but the music was loud and most of the guests were deep in celebration. A few heads turned, but no one seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. Michael's father, Robert, actually grabbed my arm as I tried to follow, telling me to let Daniel handle the situation, that children needed to learn consequences for telling lies. I wrenched free, leaving nail marks on his arm, and ran toward the service entrance where Daniel had disappeared with my daughter. The hotel kitchen was a maze of stainless steel and steam, busy with staff who looked startled as I burst through. I could hear Sophie screaming somewhere ahead, the sound tearing through me like physical pain. I followed the sound, pushing past confused servers and cooks, until I reached the back area where the walk-in freezer stood like a giant metal tomb. The heavy door was closed, but I could hear Sophie's muffled cries from inside, along with Daniel's voice, cruel and measured, telling her this was what happened to children who tried to destroy families with their lies. I yanked on the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Daniel had somehow locked or barricaded it from the outside. I pounded on the door, screaming for him to let her out, that she was telling the truth, that I'd seen Brandon attacking Melissa too. Daniel just laughed, that same calculated coldness I'd seen in Brandon's face, and told me I should have taught my daughter to mind her own business. The temperature readout on the freezer door showed 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Sophie was in there in nothing but her thin party dress. Several kitchen staff had gathered by this point, looking uncertain about whether to intervene in what was clearly a family dispute. I begged them to help, to call security, to do something, but they seemed paralyzed by indecision. It wasn't until Madison and two of the teenage cousins burst into the kitchen, having followed the commotion, that things shifted. Madison's boyfriend, a linebacker on the high school football team, took one look at the situation and body-slammed the freezer door. It took 3 tries before the makeshift barricade Daniel had created gave way. Sophie tumbled out of the freezer, lips blue and body shaking violently from more than just the cold. She was wrapped in what looked like a dirty kitchen apron, her beautiful dress soaked with fish water from the freezer floor. She couldn't stop shaking, couldn't catch her breath, and I knew immediately we needed medical help. I scooped her into my arms, her body feeling far too light and fragile, and ran for the exit. Behind me, I could hear Daniel shouting about pressing charges for assault, about suing for defamation, about how we'd regret this. The drive to the nearest urgent care centre was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Sophie huddled in the back seat, wrapped in my coat, her breathing ragged and painful. I called Michael, trying to explain through my tears what had happened, but I could barely get the words out. All he understood was that Sophie was hurt and we were heading to urgent care. He said he'd meet us there, and I could hear him already running to his car, tools clattering to the ground, forgotten. The urgent care centre was blessedly quiet, and they took Sophie back immediately when they saw her condition. The doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, examined Sophie thoroughly while I held her hand. Physically, the damage was limited to bruising on her arm where Daniel had grabbed her and mild hypothermia from the freezer. The psychological damage was harder to quantify. Sophie couldn't stop shaking, kept asking why Uncle Daniel had locked her up when she was just trying to help Melissa. Dr. Martinez documented everything meticulously, took photographs of the bruises, and gently suggested we file a police report. Michael arrived just as Dr. Martinez was finishing her examination. I'd never seen him look so devastated and furious at the same time. He held Sophie while I explained everything that had happened, from witnessing Brandon's assault on Melissa to Daniel locking our daughter in the freezer. With each word, Michael's face grew darker, his jaw clenched so tight I feared he might crack his teeth. When I finished, he very carefully kissed Sophie's forehead, told her how brave she was, and then stood up with a look that made me grab his arm. I knew that look. It was the same expression he'd had years ago when a drunk driver had nearly hit Sophie in a crosswalk. Michael was not a violent man by nature, but when it came to our daughter, he would move heaven and earth to protect her. I begged him not to go back to the hotel, reminded him that Sophie needed us both here with her, not in jail for assault. It took every ounce of his self-control, but he stayed, though I could see the effort it cost him in the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching. Dr. Martinez returned with discharge papers and a referral to a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. She'd also called the police as mandated reporters required when child abuse was suspected. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, a man and woman who introduced themselves as Officers Chen and Rodrigo. They were patient and kind with Sophie, letting her tell the story in her own words while Officer Chen took detailed notes. Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper, but she was clear and precise in her recounting, even when describing the cold and the dark and the fear that Uncle Daniel would leave her there forever. The officers exchanged meaningful looks when Sophie mentioned that other adults had been present but hadn't helped. Officer Rodrigo asked for names, and I provided them, including Robert's interference when I'd tried to follow Daniel. They took photographs of Sophie's bruises to supplement the medical documentation and said they would be visiting the hotel to interview witnesses and review security footage. They gave us a case number and victim's advocate information before leaving, promising to follow up within 24 hours. We took Sophie home, where she immediately wanted to shower, saying she could still smell the fish from the freezer. I sat on the bathroom floor while she showered, talking to her through the curtain about anything and everything except what had happened. Michael paced the hallway like a caged animal, occasionally punching the wall softly enough not to damage it but hard enough that I worried about his knuckles. When Sophie finally emerged, wrapped in her favorite fleece pajamas and fuzzy socks, she looked so young and vulnerable it broke my heart all over again. That first night was hell. Sophie couldn't sleep alone, couldn't stand having her bedroom door closed, couldn't stop shivering even under multiple blankets. We set up a makeshift bed on our bedroom floor, where she could see us and feel safe. Every time she dozed off, she'd jerk awake, gasping, phantom cold making her kick at the blankets in panic. Michael and I took turns sitting with her, holding her hand, reminding her she was safe and warm and loved. Neither of us slept more than a few minutes at a time. The next morning, Michael's phone started ringing before 7. His mother, Barbara, was the first call, alternating between concern for Sophie and defense of Daniel. She insisted there must have been a misunderstanding, that Daniel would never intentionally hurt a child, that Sophie must have exaggerated what happened. Michael's response was volcanic. I'd never heard him speak to his mother that way, each word precise and cutting as he told her exactly what her precious son had done to our daughter. The call ended with Michael telling her not to contact us again until she was ready to acknowledge the truth and apologize to Sophie. More calls followed from various family members, each with their own version of events they hadn't witnessed. Some were supportive, horrified by what Daniel had done. Others tried to minimize it, suggesting that discipline had gotten out of hand, but surely we weren't going to involve the police over a family matter. Michael fielded these calls with increasing anger until I finally took his phone and turned it off. We had more important things to focus on than family politics. Sophie spent most of Sunday curled on the couch with me, watching her favorite movies and trying to eat the comfort foods we offered. She managed a few bites of mac and cheese, a half slice of toast, but her appetite was gone. She kept asking questions that broke my heart. Why did Uncle Daniel punish her for telling the truth? Why didn't Grandpa Robert help? Why did Brandon hurt Melissa? I tried to answer honestly but age-appropriately, explaining that sometimes adults made very bad choices, and that what happened wasn't her fault. She'd done the right thing by speaking up. Michael spent Sunday making phone calls of a different nature. He reached out to a lawyer friend for advice, contacted our insurance company about therapy coverage, and began documenting everything that had happened in a detailed timeline. He also discovered something interesting while going through social media. Several wedding guests had posted videos from the reception, and in the background of one, you could clearly see Daniel dragging Sophie toward the kitchen while she struggled. It wasn't perfect evidence, but it was something. Monday morning brought new challenges. Sophie was supposed to return to school, but she had a panic attack at the thought of leaving the house. The school counselor, Mrs. Peterson, was understanding when I called to explain the situation. She promised to have Sophie's teachers send homework and offered to do a video session with Sophie later in the week when she felt ready. I was grateful for the support but worried about Sophie falling behind in her studies. She'd always been such a dedicated student, and I hated seeing another part of her normal life disrupted. The police called Monday afternoon with an update. They'd interviewed several wedding guests and reviewed security footage from the hotel. While the kitchen cameras had conveniently been offline that night, they had clear footage of Daniel dragging Sophie through the service corridor and of me running after them. They'd also interviewed Madison and her boyfriend, who corroborated Sophie's account of being locked in the freezer. Brandon had been questioned about the incident with Melissa, but she was reluctant to press charges, and without her cooperation, that investigation was stalled. Tuesday brought an unexpected visitor. Melissa showed up at our door looking haggard and lost. She'd heard about what happened to Sophie because of her, and the guilt was eating her alive. I invited her in, and she broke down completely, sobbing on our couch while apologizing over and over. Sophie, brave soul that she was, came and sat beside her, taking Melissa's hand and telling her it wasn't her fault, that Brandon was the bad guy, not her. It was such a mature response from my 13-year-old that I had to leave the room to compose myself. Melissa stayed for 2 hours, during which she revealed this wasn't the first time Brandon had cornered her. It had been happening throughout the wedding planning, escalating at the reception when he'd been drinking. She'd been too afraid to tell Ashley, worried about ruining her friend's happiness and breaking up the wedding. Now she felt responsible for what happened to Sophie. We assured her repeatedly that Daniel's actions were his own choice, not her fault, but I could see she didn't believe us. She left with our phone number and a promise to stay in touch. Wednesday was Sophie's first therapy appointment with Dr. Sarah Winters, the trauma specialist Dr. Martinez had recommended. Michael and I sat in the waiting room, holding hands and trying not to watch the clock. 50 minutes felt like 50 hours. When Sophie emerged, she looked tired but somehow lighter. Dr. Winters spoke with us briefly, outlining her treatment plan and giving us strategies to help Sophie at home. She was optimistic about Sophie's recovery, but warned it would take time and patience. The night terrors might continue for weeks or even months. Thursday brought lawyers into the mix. Daniel had hired a high-powered defense attorney and was claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He admitted to putting Sophie in the freezer but claimed it was only for a minute to cool her down after she became hysterical and started spreading lies about Brandon. The security footage contradicted this timeline, showing a full 8 minutes between when he entered the kitchen area and when Madison's boyfriend broke down the door. 8 minutes in a 32-degree freezer wearing only a party dress. Our lawyer, recommended by Michael's friend, was a former prosecutor named Janet Coleman who specialized in child abuse cases. She reviewed all our documentation with sharp eyes and pronounced it one of the stronger cases she'd seen. The video evidence, medical documentation, and multiple witnesses gave us an excellent foundation. She also mentioned that she'd handled cases against Daniel before, in her prosecutor days, though she couldn't share details due to confidentiality. The way her jaw tightened when she said his name told me everything I needed to know. Friday's challenge came from an unexpected source: Sophie's school. Despite Mrs. Peterson's initial support, we received a call from the principal, Mr. Harrison, expressing concern about Sophie's extended absence. He mentioned that Daniel's lawyer had contacted the school, suggesting we were keeping Sophie home to coach her testimony. The accusation was so outrageous I couldn't speak for several seconds. Michael took the phone from me and very calmly but firmly explained that our daughter was suffering from trauma-induced anxiety and was under a doctor's care. Any further harassment from Daniel's legal team would be met with our own legal action. The weekend brought what should have been a respite but instead became a new battleground. Barbara had been calling Michael's phone non-stop since he'd hung up on her Sunday. When he continued to ignore her calls, she showed up at our house Saturday morning. I answered the door to find her on our porch, perfectly coiffed as always, but with red-rimmed eyes that suggested she'd been crying. She asked to see Sophie, claimed she just wanted to make sure her granddaughter was okay. I might have believed her if Daniel hadn't been sitting in her car in our driveway. The sight of his car sent Sophie into a complete panic. She'd been in the kitchen having breakfast when she saw him through the window. Her scream brought Michael running from his office, and he took one look at the situation before storming outside. I watched from the doorway holding Sophie behind me, as Michael confronted his brother. The conversation was brief but intense. Daniel tried to approach the house, claiming he wanted to apologize, but Michael made it clear that one step closer would result in a violation of the emergency restraining order we'd filed. Barbara cried and pleaded, but Michael was unmovable. They left, but not before Daniel shouted that we were destroying the family. That afternoon, we discovered just how far Daniel was willing to go. A Child Protective Services worker showed up at our door, responding to an anonymous complaint about child neglect and emotional abuse. The worker, Ms. Thompson, was professional but thorough, inspecting our home and interviewing each of us separately. Sophie handled it remarkably well, clearly and calmly explaining what had happened at the wedding and why she was currently being homeschooled. Ms. Thompson took notes but seemed skeptical of the complaint from the start, especially when we showed her the police report and medical documentation. The CPS visit was the final straw for Michael. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, we sat at the kitchen table and made a decision. We would not just defend ourselves against Daniel's attacks. We would go on the offensive. Michael had been doing research and discovered some interesting patterns in Daniel's past. Both of his ex-wives had filed restraining orders during their divorces, citing emotional abuse and financial manipulation. One had alleged child abuse regarding her son from a previous relationship, though the case had been dropped when she relocated out of state. Sunday dinner at Barbara's house was obviously out of the question, but we heard through family grapevines about the drama that unfolded there. Madison, bless her teenage heart, had stood up during dinner and announced that she'd recorded Daniel admitting to locking Sophie in the freezer on purpose to teach her a lesson. She played the recording for everyone present, Daniel's own voice clear and damning. The recording also captured him saying something about teaching Brandon how to handle difficult women, which sent several family members storming out in disgust. Monday marked 2 weeks since the wedding, and changes were happening rapidly. Brandon and Ashley's marriage was already crumbling. Melissa had finally told Ashley everything, and other women came forward with similar stories about Brandon's behavior. The fairy tale wedding had been a sham, built on lies and hidden violence. Ashley moved back in with her parents, the annulment papers already filed. Brandon tried to blame everyone else, claiming Sophie's lies had poisoned his wife against him, but the truth has a way of surfacing when brave people speak it. Michael's investigation into Daniel yielded fruit quicker than expected. Through his network of engineering contacts, he found a forensic accountant willing to look into some irregularities. What started as curiosity about Daniel's expensive lifestyle on a solo practitioner's income revealed something much darker. Daniel had been systematically draining funds from elderly clients' accounts, small amounts that often went unnoticed but added up to significant sums over time. His mother, Barbara, was one of his victims, though she didn't know it yet. The forensic accountant, Martin Chen, worked methodically through the financial records we could legally access. Court documents from Daniel's divorces painted a picture of hidden assets and financial manipulation. Business registration records showed multiple LLCs that seemed to exist only on paper. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Teresa, Daniel's paralegal girlfriend, reached out to us privately. She'd overheard Daniel on the phone discussing moving assets offshore and destroying documents. Her conscience wouldn't let her remain silent. Teresa met us at a coffee shop downtown, nervous and constantly checking over her shoulder. She'd brought copies of documents she'd managed to save before Daniel started his destruction spree. Bank statements showing transfers from client trust accounts to personal accounts. Emails discussing how to hide assets from bankruptcy proceedings. Most damning of all, a recording she'd made of Daniel bragging about how easy it was to steal from clients who trusted him completely. She was terrified of retaliation but more afraid of being complicit in hurting innocent people. We took everything to the police, who were already building their case about the freezer incident. The Financial Crimes Division became involved, and suddenly Daniel was facing more than just child endangerment charges. Federal investigators started interviewing his clients, and the stories that emerged were heartbreaking. Elderly people who'd trusted him with their life savings, only to find themselves mysteriously short of funds when they needed long-term care. Widows whose husbands' estates had been drained through excessive fees and unexplained transfers. Sophie continued her therapy twice a week, slowly making progress. The night terrors decreased from nightly to several times a week. She could stay in a room alone for short periods, though she still needed doors left open. Dr. Winters introduced EMDR therapy to help process the trauma, and we saw glimpses of our confident daughter returning. She even asked about returning to school, though we decided to finish the semester with homeschooling to avoid additional stress during the legal proceedings. The preliminary hearing for the criminal case was set for 6 weeks after the incident. Janet Coleman prepared us thoroughly, especially Sophie, who would need to testify. We practiced in her office, with Janet playing the role of the defense attorney to help Sophie get comfortable with potentially hostile questioning. Sophie was nervous but determined, understanding that her testimony could protect other children from Daniel. Her bravery amazed me daily. During this time, we learned about Daniel's other victims. Christina Walsh reached out after seeing the news coverage about Daniel's arrest. Her son, now 17, had been Daniel's stepson during his first marriage. She shared horrific stories of psychological torture Daniel had inflicted on the boy, locking him in closets and basements as punishment for minor infractions. They'd fled the state to escape him, starting over with new identities. She was willing to testify if it would help put him away. The family dynamics shifted dramatically as more truth emerged. Some relatives who'd initially defended Daniel went silent as evidence mounted. Others came forward with their own suspicions and stories they'd been afraid to share. Michael's Aunt Phyllis admitted she'd always felt uneasy about how Daniel handled her late husband's estate, but had been too intimidated to question him. When she finally reviewed the records, she discovered nearly $50,000 in unexplained fees and transfers. 3 weeks before the trial, Daniel made a catastrophic mistake. Despite the restraining order and bail conditions, he showed up at Sophie's soccer practice. He didn't approach her directly, just stood at the edge of the field watching. Other parents noticed immediately, recognizing him from news coverage. One father, a contractor named Gerald, approached him and asked him to leave. Daniel, in his arrogance, shoved Gerald and declared he had a right to watch his niece play. Gerald, showing admirable restraint, didn't retaliate, but called the police immediately. Daniel was arrested at the field, violating his bail conditions. This time the judge had no patience for his excuses. Bail was revoked, and Daniel would await trial in county jail. Sophie heard about this at practice from her teammates' parents, who'd formed a protective circle around the children when Daniel appeared. She smiled for the first time in weeks when she learned he was locked up, asking if the jail was cold like the freezer. We assured her it wasn't, but that he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone for a long time. The trial preparation intensified with Daniel behind bars. His lawyer, a slick defender named Scott Morrison, tried every delay tactic in the book. He filed motion after motion, claiming everything from prosecutorial misconduct to mental incompetence. Each was denied by Judge Patricia Hernandez, a former family court judge with little patience for those who hurt children. She scheduled the trial for the earliest possible date, understanding the importance of swift justice for Sophie's healing. During this time, Barbara finally faced the truth about her son. The forensic accounting revealed he'd stolen over $40,000 from her retirement accounts over 3 years. She came to our house one evening, looking decades older than her 68 years. She apologized to Sophie with tears streaming down her face, acknowledging she'd failed to protect her granddaughter and enabled Daniel's behavior for too long. Sophie, showing grace beyond her years, hugged her grandmother and told her it wasn't her fault that Daniel was broken. The trial lasted 5 days. The prosecution, led by ADA Jennifer Park, methodically laid out the case. Security footage, medical records, witness testimony, and Daniel's own recorded words painted a clear picture of a man who used his position and family connections to abuse vulnerable people. Christina Walsh flew in from Portland with her son, both testifying about years of abuse during Daniel's first marriage. Their testimony was devastating, describing a pattern of escalating cruelty that Daniel seemed to enjoy. Sophie testified on day 3. She wore the purple dress we'd bought specifically for court, looking young but determined. She spoke clearly and didn't waver, even under cross-examination. When Morrison tried to suggest she'd misunderstood or exaggerated, she calmly repeated what happened, detail by detail. She described the cold, the fear, the sound of Daniel's laughter through the freezer door. Several jurors were visibly moved, and one had to wipe away tears. The defense's case was weak. Daniel testified against his lawyer's advice, unable to resist the urge to control the narrative. He tried to paint himself as a concerned uncle disciplining a wayward child, but his temper betrayed him. When confronted with the recording Madison had made, he exploded, shouting that they all deserved what they got, that children needed to learn respect, that his mother owed him for years of being the responsible son. The mask slipped completely, revealing the monster beneath. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: child endangerment, false imprisonment, assault, and multiple counts of fraud and elder abuse. Sophie watched from the gallery as the verdict was read, her hand in mine, no longer shaking. When the judge announced the guilty verdict, she didn't smile or cheer, just nodded solemnly, as if confirming what she already knew to be true. Justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow given all we'd lost. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Hernandez, known for her tough stance on crimes against children and the elderly, didn't disappoint. Daniel received 12 years in state prison, more than the prosecution had even asked for. The judge cited the particular cruelty of his crimes, the violation of trust, and the psychological damage inflicted on multiple victims. As they led him away, Daniel screamed threats and promises of revenge until the bailiff forcefully removed him from the courtroom. It was the last time we'd have to hear his voice. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected healing. Other families who'd been silent about their suspicions came forward, creating an informal support group. We learned Daniel had left a trail of damaged relationships and violated trust throughout his life. His ex-wives reached out, sharing their relief that he was finally facing consequences. Teresa, who'd been granted immunity for her cooperation, started over at a new firm dedicated to protecting elderly clients from exploitation. She sent Sophie a card thanking her for the courage that inspired her own. Sophie returned to school for the spring semester, supported by friends who'd rallied around her during her absence. There were still challenges, moments when unexpected triggers would bring back the trauma, but she faced them with remarkable resilience. She started speaking at her therapy group about the importance of telling the truth, even when powerful adults try to silence you. Dr. Winters said Sophie's recovery was exceptional, crediting the strong support system we'd built around her. The extended family dynamics permanently shifted. Those who'd stood by Daniel or remained neutral found themselves excluded from gatherings. A new normal emerged, smaller but healthier, centered on protecting children and believing survivors. Barbara sold the family home, downsizing to a condo and donating the proceeds from Daniel's belongings to a charity supporting abuse survivors. She became one of Sophie's fiercest advocates, determined to atone for her past enabling. Michael and I grew closer through the ordeal. our marriage strengthened by facing the crisis together. We'd seen each other at our most vulnerable and most fierce, united in protecting our daughter. We started attending our own therapy sessions, processing the secondary trauma and guilt over missing earlier warning signs. The therapist reminded us that predators are skilled at hiding their nature, that we'd acted immediately when the truth was revealed. It helped, though the what-ifs still haunted quiet moments. 6 months after the wedding, Ashley reached out to thank Sophie personally. She'd finalized her annulment and was in therapy, working through the deception of her relationship with Brandon. She told Sophie that her bravery in speaking up had saved Ashley from years of potential abuse. They developed an unlikely friendship, with Ashley becoming something of a big sister figure to Sophie, proof that good could emerge from even the darkest situations. The financial restitution process moved slowly through the courts, but Daniel's victims would eventually recover most of their stolen funds through asset forfeiture and insurance claims. His law license was permanently revoked, ensuring he could never again use professional trust as a weapon. The State Bar Association used his case as an example in continuing education courses about ethical violations and the importance of oversight in elder law practices. Sophie's 14th birthday came with a mix of emotions. We kept the celebration small, just close family and friends who'd supported us through the trial. She blew out her candles with a wish she later told me was for all the other kids who might be hurt by people like Uncle Daniel to find someone who would believe them and help them. Her perspective on the world had changed, matured in ways I wished hadn't been necessary, but her compassion had only grown stronger. The night terrors eventually faded to occasional bad dreams. Sophie could sleep in her own room with the door closed, though she kept a nightlight and her phone always within reach. She returned to her normal activities, excelling in school and rejoicing in the violin. At her spring concert, she played a solo that moved the audience to tears, the music carrying all the emotions she couldn't put into words. We sat in the front row, Michael and I, Barbara and Madison, and even Teresa, all united in celebrating Sophie's resilience. A year after the wedding, we received notice that Daniel had been placed in solitary confinement after attacking another inmate who'd confronted him about his crimes against children. Prison justice, while not something I would ever advocate for, seemed to be finding him. He continued to write letters proclaiming his innocence and victimhood, which we forwarded unopened to the prosecutor's office as required. His words had no power over us anymore. Sophie started volunteering at a local youth centre, mentoring younger children and teaching basic self-defense skills. She shared her story when appropriate, always emphasizing that speaking up about abuse was brave and necessary, even when the abuser was family. Especially then. The centre's director told us Sophie had a gift for connecting with troubled kids, perhaps because she understood that darkness could hide behind familiar faces. The ripple effects of that horrible night continued spreading in positive ways. Our local school district implemented new training for recognizing and responding to child abuse disclosures. The hotel where the wedding occurred revised their security protocols and staff training. Several other families found the courage to report suspicious behavior by trusted authority figures. Sophie's bravery had started a chain reaction of truth-telling that protected unknown numbers of potential victims. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how different things might have been if Sophie hadn't seen Brandon in that hallway, if she hadn't spoken up, if we hadn't believed her immediately. The what-ifs could drive you crazy. But Sophie herself put it best during a recent therapy session we attended together. She said that Uncle Daniel had always been dangerous, like a wolf pretending to be a family dog. Her speaking up didn't create the danger, it exposed it. And by exposing it, she protected not just herself but all his future victims. Our family looks different now than it did before that wedding. It's smaller, with clear boundaries, and zero tolerance for those who enable abuse. But it's also stronger, built on a foundation of truth and mutual protection. We've learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to create safe spaces for each other to grow and heal. Sometimes that means cutting off those who threaten that safety, no matter how painful. Sophie is 15 now, taller and more confident, though still sleeping with that nightlight. She's made peace with what happened in her own way, understanding that Uncle Daniel's actions came from his own darkness, not from anything she did wrong. She knows her voice matters, that truth spoken courageously can topple those who seem untouchable. It's a heavy lesson for someone so young, but she carries it with grace that amazes everyone who meets her. The legal proceedings are mostly finished, though appeals and financial settlements continue grinding through the system. Daniel won't be eligible for parole for at least 8 years, and will be there at every hearing to remind the board why he needs to stay locked away. Not out of vengeance, but out of protection for all the children and elderly people who could become his next victims if he's released too soon. We still have family dinners, just with a different configuration. Barbara hosts them in her new condo, the grandchildren running through smaller spaces, but with bigger smiles. There's laughter again, genuine and unforced. Madison, now in college, always makes sure to sit next to Sophie, their bond forged in crisis but maintained through genuine affection. The family that remains is one that prioritizes protection over reputation, truth over comfort. Some nights, when Sophie is safely asleep and the house is quiet, I think about Melissa and all the other women who've been cornered by men like Brandon, silenced by fear and shame. I think about all the children locked in freezers or closets or basements by those who should protect them. I hope our story, Sophie's story, gives them courage to speak up, to find someone who will believe them and fight for them. Because that's all it takes sometimes, one person willing to say, "I believe you," and mean it. The trauma inflicted that night at the wedding will always be part of our story, but it doesn't define us. What defines us is how we responded, how we refused to be silenced, how we turned pain into purpose. Sophie often says she wishes it hadn't happened, but she's glad she spoke up. She understands now that her voice, raised in truth despite terrible consequences, may have saved lives. That's a heavy burden for a young girl, but she bears it with the strength of someone who's faced darkness and chosen light. As I finish writing this, Sophie is at soccer practice, laughing with her teammates under the watchful eyes of parents who now know to look for danger even in familiar faces. Michael is in his office working on a proposal for a new safety system, his protective instincts channeled into making the world a bit safer for everyone. And I'm here, putting our story into words, hoping it reaches someone who needs to hear it. Someone whose child has told them an uncomfortable truth. Someone who's wavering between family loyalty and doing what's right. The message is simple. Believe the children. Protect the vulnerable. Choose truth over comfort. Family isn't about protecting predators. It's about creating safe spaces for everyone to thrive. Sometimes that means difficult choices, painful revelations, and permanent changes. But the alternative, the silence that enables abuse, is far worse. Sophie's courage taught us that. A 13-year-old girl stood up to powerful adults and won. Not because she was exceptionally brave, but because she was supported and believed. That's the world we're trying to build now. One where children like Sophie don't have to be heroes, where speaking the truth doesn't result in being locked in freezers, where families rally around victims instead of protecting abusers. It's not a perfect world yet, far from it. But every time someone reads our story and examines their own family dynamics, every time a child finds the courage to speak up, every time an adult chooses to believe and protect rather than doubt and enable, we get a little closer. Daniel is serving his 12 years, but we're serving a life sentence of vigilance and advocacy. It's a sentence we accept gladly if it means no other child experiences what Sophie did. The freezer door that trapped her that night opened something in all of us, a determination to never again let politeness or family pressure override our instinct to protect the innocent. That's Daniel's true legacy, though certainly not the one he intended. In trying to silence one brave girl, he amplified her voice into a chorus that will outlast his prison term. The sun is setting now, painting the mountains in those same pink and gold shades they wore the night of the wedding. But instead of dread, I feel hope. Sophie will be home soon, hungry and chattering about her day. Michael will emerge from his office and we'll have dinner together. An ordinary evening made precious by all we've overcome. We'll probably watch a movie, Sophie wedged between us on the couch, safe and loved and free to speak her truth. That's victory. Not the guilty verdict or the prison sentence, but these quiet moments of normal life that trauma tried to steal. Every laugh, every peaceful night's sleep, every time Sophie speaks up in class or stands up for a friend, we win again. Daniel thought he could break her, silence her, make her small and afraid. He failed spectacularly. She's stronger than ever, a young woman who knows her worth and refuses to let anyone diminish it. Our story doesn't end with they lived happily ever after because real life doesn't work that way. Trauma leaves scars. Trust once broken takes time to rebuild, and some family relationships are permanently altered. But we're living fully and authentically, no longer keeping secrets or enabling abuse for the sake of false peace. We're teaching Sophie and showing others that survival isn't just about getting through trauma, but about transforming it into purpose. Years from now, when Sophie is an adult with perhaps children of her own, she'll carry these lessons forward. She'll know how to recognize red flags, how to listen when children speak uncomfortable truths, how to choose protection over reputation. The cycle of enabling abuse in our family ends with her generation. That's the ultimate victory, the long-term change that makes all the pain worthwhile. One brave girl speaking up, one family choosing truth, rippling outward into lasting transformation. The stars are coming out now, real ones, not the artificial lights of a hotel ballroom. Sophie's home, safe and chattering about her day as predicted. Michael's making his famous spaghetti while Sophie sets the table. Our evening routine a testament to resilience and recovery. We've travelled far from that horrific night, through legal battles and family upheaval, through therapy and tears and slow healing. But we've travelled together, and that makes all the difference. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, as all tomorrows do. But it won't bring Daniel or his toxicity into our lives. It won't bring the silence that enables predators or the misplaced loyalty that protects abusers over victims. It will bring opportunity for Sophie to continue growing into the remarkable young woman she's becoming, shaped by trauma but not defined by it. It will bring another day of choosing truth over comfort, protection over reputation, love over fear. That's our story, shared in hope that it helps someone else choose courage. A story of a 13-year-old girl who saw wrong being done and spoke up, even when powerful adults tried to silence her. A story of parents who believed their child immediately and fought fiercely for justice. A story of a family that chose difficult truth over comfortable lies. Most of all, a story of survival and transformation, of turning the worst night of our lives into a catalyst for necessary change. Sophie just asked what I'm writing, and I told her I'm sharing our story. She nodded thoughtfully and said to make sure I mentioned that it's okay to be scared when you speak up about abuse, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. She wants other kids to know they're not alone, that there are adults who will believe them and fight for them. She wants families to understand that protecting children is more important than protecting reputation. Wise words from someone who learned these truths too young but carries them with grace. So that's what I'll end with, Sophie's message to anyone who needs to hear it. Speaking truth about abuse is scary but necessary. Your voice matters, even if powerful people try to silence it. There are adults who will believe you and protect you. Keep speaking until you find them. And to the adults reading this, when a child tells you something that makes you uncomfortable, something that challenges your assumptions about people you trust, please listen. Please believe. Please act. The freezer door that trapped my daughter could have been prevented if just one adult at that wedding had chosen protection over politeness. Don't let another child suffer in silence. Don't let another predator hide behind family connections. Don't let another Sophie spend 8 minutes in a freezer because she dared to speak the truth. The cost of silence is too high, measured in traumatized children and enabled predators. The cost of speaking up might be family disruption and uncomfortable revelations, but the reward is safety, justice, and the knowledge that you stood on the right side when it mattered most. Our story continues. Each day a new page in our journey of healing and advocacy. Daniel's story, at least the part where he could hurt others, has ended with a prison cell. The contrast is stark and appropriate. Those who choose to abuse face consequences. Those who choose to survive and speak truth find freedom, even if the path to get there is difficult. We chose the difficult path, and we'd choose it again, because our daughter's safety and the safety of all potential victims matter more than false family harmony. In the months following the trial, we discovered the true extent of Daniel's web of manipulation. Teresa, who had become something of an ally in our fight for justice, shared more documents she'd hidden before Daniel's arrest. These papers revealed a pattern of abuse stretching back 20 years, involving not just financial crimes, but a systematic targeting of vulnerable families. Each revelation felt like peeling back layers of a particularly rotten onion, the stench of corruption growing stronger with every document we examined. One name kept appearing in these records: Jennifer Hartley, Daniel's first wife. We'd heard mentions of her during the trial, but she'd been impossible to locate. Teresa gave us a possible lead, an old friend of Jennifer's who might know how to reach her. After several phone calls and dead ends, we finally connected with Jennifer herself. She was living in Maine under a different name, having fled Colorado 15 years ago with her young son to escape Daniel's escalating abuse. Jennifer's story mirrored ours in haunting ways. Her son, Marcus, had been 8 when Daniel entered their lives. At first, Daniel had been the perfect stepfather, lavishing attention and gifts on the boy. But once they married, the mask slipped. Minor infractions like leaving toys out or speaking too loudly resulted in hours locked in the basement. Jennifer had been too terrified to leave, convinced by Daniel that no one would believe her, that he'd use his legal connections to take Marcus away. The breaking point came when Marcus, then 10, tried to tell his teacher about the punishments. Daniel had locked him in a storage closet at his law office for an entire weekend, telling Jennifer the boy was at a friend's house. When she discovered the truth, she knew they had to run. She packed what they could carry and disappeared in the night, driving across the country with no destination except away. They'd built a new life in a small coastal town where Daniel's influence couldn't reach, but the scars remained. Marcus, now 25 and working as a social worker specializing in childhood trauma, wanted to help our case however possible. He flew to Colorado to meet us, a quiet young man with watchful eyes that reminded me painfully of Sophie after the freezer incident. Over coffee, he shared techniques that had helped him heal, books that had made a difference, therapists who understood complex trauma. Most importantly, he showed Sophie that survival was possible, that she could build a good life despite what Daniel had done. The meeting between Sophie and Marcus was profound. Here was living proof that Daniel's victims could thrive, could transform their pain into purpose. Marcus told Sophie about his nightmares, how they'd lasted for years but eventually faded. He shared how he'd learned to trust again, slowly and carefully, but successfully. When Sophie asked if he still thought about what happened, he was honest. Yes, he did. But the memories no longer controlled him. They'd become part of his story, not his entire identity. This connection led to others. Through victim support groups and legal channels, we found more people Daniel had hurt. A former client named Eleanor, now 91, who'd lost her entire retirement savings to his schemes. A paralegal who'd worked for him briefly 10 years ago and quit after witnessing him verbally abuse a junior attorney until she had a panic attack. Each story added weight to our understanding of who Daniel really was. A serial predator who'd refined his techniques over decades. The financial investigation expanded beyond what anyone expected. Federal authorities discovered Daniel had been running a complex scheme involving offshore accounts and shell companies. The elder abuse was just the tip of the iceberg. He'd been laundering money for other criminals, using his law practice as a front. the FBI got involved, and suddenly our family drama became part of a much larger federal case. We attended meetings in sterile government buildings, answered questions from agents who revealed nothing while expecting everything. During this time, Sophie's recovery continued its non-linear path. Some days were good, filled with normal teenage concerns like homework and friend drama. Other days, a smell or sound would trigger a flashback, and she'd be 13 again, trapped in the cold. We learned to navigate these setbacks with patience and understanding. Dr. Winters introduced new therapeutic techniques, including art therapy where Sophie could express feelings she couldn't verbalize. Her paintings from this period were dark but powerful, abstract representations of fear giving way to strength. School presented ongoing challenges. While most of Sophie's classmates were supportive, whispers followed her through the hallways. Some parents, those who still maintained relationships with Daniel's supporters, told their children to stay away from our troublemaking daughter. Sophie handled it with more grace than I would have, focusing on her true friends and refusing to be shamed for speaking the truth. Her grades remained excellent, and she threw herself into extracurriculars as a way to stay busy and connected. One particularly difficult day came when Sophie had to do a presentation on personal heroes for her English class. She chose to speak about the kids at the wedding who'd tried to help her, especially Madison. As she described that night, several students started crying. The teacher later told us it was the most powerful presentation she'd witnessed in 20 years of teaching. Sophie's vulnerability in sharing her story created a ripple effect, with other students finding courage to speak about their own difficult experiences. The extended family situation remained complicated. While some relatives had clearly chosen sides, others existed in an uncomfortable middle ground. They believed Sophie but struggled with completely cutting off Daniel, especially those who'd known him since childhood. These fence-sitters caused perhaps more pain than the outright deniers because their conditional support felt like a betrayal. We had several difficult conversations about boundaries, explaining that there was no neutral ground when it came to child abuse. Michael's work suffered during this period, though his employer remained supportive. The stress manifested in physical symptoms, headaches, insomnia, and a constant state of hypervigilance. He started seeing his own therapist, working through guilt about not protecting Sophie from the initial trauma and processing his own childhood experiences with family dysfunction. It was difficult for him to be vulnerable, but he knew modeling healthy coping mechanisms was important for Sophie's recovery. My own business nearly collapsed from neglect. The handmade jewelry that had once brought me joy felt frivolous in the face of our family crisis. Orders piled up unfilled until I had to issue refunds and temporarily close the shop. Regular customers expressed concern and support, many sharing their own stories of family trauma. Eventually, I found my way back to creating, but the pieces changed. Where once I'd made light decorative items, now I crafted pieces with meaning: survivor ribbons, strength symbols, and custom orders for others on healing journeys. The financial strain was significant. Legal fees, even with Janet Coleman giving us a reduced rate, mounted quickly. Therapy costs, even with insurance, added up. We dipped into Sophie's college fund, a decision that hurt but felt necessary. Michael took on extra projects when he could focus, and I slowly rebuilt my business with a new focus on meaningful pieces for survivors. The community support was overwhelming, with fundraisers organized by soccer parents and anonymous donations appearing in our mailbox. 6 months into Daniel's incarceration, we received word that he'd been placed in protective custody after other inmates learned about his crimes against children. Prison justice, while brutal, seemed to find those who hurt kids. We felt no satisfaction in this news, only a weary recognition that violence begetting violence solved nothing. Sophie, when she heard, said she didn't want Uncle Daniel hurt, just stopped. Her compassion even for her abuser showed a maturity and wisdom I'm not sure I possessed. The first anniversary of the wedding approached with mounting anxiety. Sophie's nightmares increased, and she started checking locks obsessively again. Dr. Winters had warned us about anniversary reactions, but experiencing it was different from expecting it. We made plans to be away that weekend, booking a cabin in the mountains where we could be together without daily reminders. The night of the anniversary, we built a bonfire, and Sophie burned the dress she'd worn to the wedding, watching the lavender fabric turn to ash and drift away on the wind. That weekend in the mountains marked a turning point. Away from the familiar triggers, Sophie opened up about fears she hadn't voiced before. She worried about becoming like Daniel, about having some darkness inside that might emerge. We talked late into the night about nature versus nurture, about choice and accountability. Michael shared stories from his own childhood, times when Daniel had shown glimpses of cruelty that everyone dismissed as sibling rivalry. We pieced together a pattern that predated Sophie's trauma by decades. Returning home, we found a letter from Brandon in our mailbox. Ashley's ex-husband had written from his own therapy program, attempting to make amends. His letter was full of self-pity and excuses, blaming alcohol and stress while minimizing his actions. Sophie read it once and asked to burn it too. We had another small fire in our backyard fire pit, Sophie feeding the pages to the flames, while saying she forgave Brandon for her own peace, but would never forget what he'd shown her about hidden dangers. The ripple effects in our community continued. Sophie's story had sparked conversations about child safety and believing survivors. The local schools implemented new training programs, and several churches started support groups for families dealing with abuse. Sophie was invited to speak at some events but declined most, feeling the weight of being a poster child for survival was too heavy. She did agree to write a letter that could be shared, focusing on the importance of adults believing children who report abuse. As Daniel's criminal trial concluded, the civil suits began. Barbara, with our support, filed to recover her stolen funds. Other elderly clients joined in a class action suit. The legal proceedings would drag on for years, we knew, but there was satisfaction in knowing Daniel's crime would follow him long after his release. His assets were frozen, his properties seized. The luxury car, the expensive suits, the country club memberships, all gone. Material justice felt hollow compared to Sophie's suffering, but it was something. Through all of this, normal life insisted on continuing. Sophie attended school dances and worried about algebra tests. She made the varsity soccer team as a freshman, her determination on the field matching her courage off it. Boys started calling, leading to new anxieties for Michael and me about dating and trust. Sophie navigated these waters carefully, more aware than her peers of how people could hide their true natures. She dated cautiously, always in groups, always with clear boundaries. The therapy continued, but less frequently. Monthly sessions replaced weekly ones as Sophie developed better coping mechanisms. She still needed occasional intensive support during triggering events, like when a new student who didn't know her story made a joke about being locked in a freezer. But mostly, she was a typical teenager dealing with typical teenage issues. The trauma would always be part of her story, but it no longer dominated every chapter. 2 years after the wedding, we received news that shook our carefully reconstructed world. Daniel had been diagnosed with terminal cancer in prison. The doctors gave him 6 months. Part of me felt this was cosmic justice, that he'd face ultimate judgment sooner than expected. But Sophie's reaction surprised me. She cried, not for the uncle who'd hurt her, but for the complicated grief of losing someone who should have been safe, who should have protected her instead of harming her. Dr. Winters explained this was normal, that grief doesn't follow logical patterns. Barbara struggled with whether to visit her dying son. The mother in her wanted to offer comfort, but the grandmother who'd failed to protect Sophie couldn't forgive. We told her to follow her heart, that we'd support whatever decision she made. She went once, returning shaken and smaller somehow. Daniel had shown no remorse, spending the visit ranting about the injustice of his situation and blaming everyone else for his downfall. It was the closure Barbara needed, the final proof that her son was beyond redemption. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning in the prison infirmary, alone except for medical staff. We learned about it from his court-appointed lawyer, who called to inform us about the death certificate and remaining legal matters. Sophie was at school when we got the call. Michael and I sat at our kitchen table, holding hands and feeling nothing but emptiness. Not relief, not satisfaction, just a hollow acknowledgement that this chapter was truly closed. When we told Sophie that evening, she nodded and asked what would happen to his body. We didn't know and realised we didn't care. The funeral arrangements fell to Barbara, who chose cremation and a private service. Only she and Michael's aunt attended. Daniel's death made the local news, described as the disgraced attorney who died while serving time for child abuse and elder fraud. Sophie read the article once and said it felt strange to see their story reduced to a paragraph, all that pain condensed into newsprint. We reminded her that the article wasn't their story, just the ending of Daniel's. Their story was still being written. In the months following Daniel's death, unexpected peace settled over our family. The constant low-level anxiety about his eventual release disappeared. Sophie's remaining symptoms improved markedly, as if her body finally believed the threat was gone. She started making plans for the future with enthusiasm instead of caution. College applications, career dreams, travel wishes. The shadow that had loomed over these dreams lifted, leaving space for normal teenage optimism. We established new family traditions to replace the toxic ones we'd left behind. Sunday dinners happened at our house now, with chosen family rather than blood relatives. Barbara came, bringing her famous apple pie and stories from Sophie's childhood that didn't involve Daniel. Marcus visited when he could, becoming an unofficial big brother to Sophie. Madison, home from college, would regale us with tales of campus life that made Sophie eager for her own adventures. These gatherings were smaller but filled with genuine warmth. The legal settlements finally concluded 3 years after the wedding. Financial restitution was distributed to Daniel's victims, including Barbara, who donated her portion to the domestic violence shelter where Michael's wife volunteered. The total amount recovered was substantial, evidence of how long Daniel had been stealing from those who trusted him. Each check sent out felt like a small victory, tangible proof that justice, while slow, could prevail. Sophie suggested we frame one of the settlement letters, a reminder that speaking truth to power works. As Sophie's senior year approached, college discussions took on new meaning. She'd decided to major in psychology with a focus on childhood trauma, hoping to become a therapist like Dr. Winters, who'd helped save her life. The essay portion of her applications told her story with unflinching honesty, describing not just the trauma, but the journey of healing and the determination to help others find their own paths forward. Every acceptance letter felt like validation of her resilience. The night before Sophie left for college, we sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance in the warm August air. She was headed to a school 1,200 miles away, far enough to build her own life but close enough to come home when needed. As we talked about her hopes and fears for this new chapter, she thanked us for believing her that night at the wedding. Such simple words for such a profound act, but they captured everything. We'd believed our daughter when it mattered most, and that had made all the difference. Michael drove the U-Haul while I rode with Sophie in her car, a graduation gift that represented freedom and trust. The miles passed with a playlist of her favourite songs and comfortable conversation about everything and nothing. At one point, she mentioned that she'd forgiven Uncle Daniel, not for his sake but for hers. Carrying hate was too heavy, she said, and she wanted to enter college unburdened. I marvelled at her wisdom, this young woman who'd transformed trauma into compassion. Moving her into the dorm was bittersweet. Every parent feels the pull of letting go, but ours carried extra weight. Sophie had fought so hard to reach this moment of independence. As we hugged goodbye, she whispered that she was okay. Really okay. And I believed her. The scared 13-year-old in the lavender dress had become a confident 18-year-old ready to change the world. Daniel had tried to freeze her in fear, but she'd chosen to burn bright instead. The drive home was quiet. Michael and I processing our empty nest feelings, along with the profound journey we'd taken as a family. We'd survived something that destroys many families, emerging scarred but stronger. Our marriage had deepened through shared purpose and mutual support. We'd learned to be advocates and warriors when needed, skills we never wanted but were grateful to possess. Most importantly, we'd raised a daughter who knew her worth and her voice mattered. Sophie thrived at college, calling regularly with updates about classes and friends and the therapy group she'd started for other survivors. She was living proof that trauma doesn't have to define your future, that you can acknowledge the darkness while choosing to walk in light. Her first semester grades were excellent, but more importantly, she was happy. The nightmares had faded to occasional bad dreams, and she'd even been able to tour the campus food service freezer without panic. During winter break, Sophie accompanied me to the women's shelter where I volunteered. She spent hours with the children, reading stories and teaching them the breathing exercises that had helped her through panic attacks. The shelter director pulled me aside to say Sophie had a gift, that the kids responded to her in ways they didn't with other volunteers. Of course they did. She understood their fear and confusion, knew what it felt like when the people who should protect you become the danger. Spring brought another milestone. Sophie's first romantic relationship with a fellow psychology major named James. She approached dating with characteristic thoughtfulness, setting clear boundaries and taking things slowly. When she brought him home for a weekend visit, I watched for red flags with probably excessive vigilance. But James was gentle and respectful, clearly awed by Sophie's strength. When she told him about Uncle Daniel, he listened without trying to fix or minimize. He understood that her story was part of her but not all of her. As sophomore year began, Sophie declared a double major in psychology and criminal justice. She wanted to understand both healing and the systems that failed to protect children like her younger self. Her professors noted her exceptional insight in classroom discussions about trauma and recovery. One encouraged her to consider graduate school, seeing potential for important research contributions. Sophie was building a future where her worst experience became the foundation for helping others heal. The 5-year anniversary of the wedding arrived with less fanfare than previous years. Sophie was at school, busy with midterms and life. She called that evening, mentioning the date only briefly before launching into excited talk about a research project on trauma-informed education practices. The girl who once couldn't speak about that night now studied it academically, turning pain into knowledge that could prevent others' suffering. It was the ultimate triumph over Daniel's attempt to silence her. Looking back over these years, I'm struck by the ordinariness of healing. It didn't happen in dramatic moments, but in thousands of small choices. Every time Sophie chose trust over fear, every night she slept peacefully, every laugh that came easily, healing happened. We couldn't undo what Daniel did, but we could choose how to move forward. We chose therapy and truth-telling and the hard work of rebuilding. We chose to believe healing was possible, even when it felt impossibly distant. Our home feels different now, lighter somehow, as if Daniel's shadow had physical weight that lifted when he died. Sophie's childhood room has been converted to a guest room, though we kept some of her things displayed. The purple butterfly she painted during art therapy hangs framed on the wall, a reminder of transformation through struggle. When she visits, she sleeps there comfortably, no longer needing us nearby to feel safe. The house that once echoed with night terrors now holds peaceful silence. The extended family has found its new configuration. Some relationships severed that night will never mend. And that's okay. We've learned that chosen family can be stronger than blood bonds. Our holiday gatherings are smaller but genuine, filled with people who stood by us when it mattered. Sophie maintains relationships with cousins who supported her, understanding they were children too, unable to stand up to the adults. Forgiveness, she's taught us, is complex and personal and doesn't require reconciliation. Michael and I renewed our vows on our 20th anniversary, wanting to formally acknowledge how profoundly we'd changed through this journey. Sophie served as our witness, reading a poem about resilience and love that left not a dry eye in the small ceremony. We'd promised to have and hold through better and worse, but couldn't have imagined how worse would test us. We emerged not unscarred but unbroken, our love deepened by seeing each other fight for our daughter when she needed us most. The ripples from that night continue spreading in positive ways. The hotel implemented strict child safety protocols and conducted background checks on all staff. Our school district now requires mandatory reporting training for all employees and volunteers. The therapy practice Dr. Winters works with expanded their trauma program, helping more families navigate the aftermath of abuse. Changes that should have existed before Sophie needed them now protect other children. Her suffering created systemic improvements that will outlast us all. Sophie graduates next year, already accepted to graduate programs in clinical psychology. She plans to specialize in treating childhood trauma, bringing both professional knowledge and personal understanding to her practice. Her thesis explores the intersection of family dynamics and institutional failures in perpetuating abuse cycles. It's groundbreaking work that her advisor believes could influence how systems respond to abuse disclosures. The 13-year-old who was punished for speaking truth now shapes how truth gets heard. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have looked like without that wedding, without Daniel's violence exposing the rot beneath our family's surface. Would Sophie have grown into the same remarkable woman without that trial by ICE? It's impossible to know. What I do know is that she took the worst thing that happened to her and transformed it into purpose. She refused to let Daniel's cruelty be the end of her story. Instead, it became a chapter that, while painful, led to growth and strength and a determination to protect others. We still have the emergency restraining order, now permanent, though it's largely symbolic since Daniel's death. Sophie keeps a copy in her apartment, not from fear but as a reminder of her agency. The legal system that initially failed her ultimately delivered justice. It's not a perfect system, often slow and sometimes blind, but it can work when people persist. We learn to navigate its complexities, to demand accountability, to refuse silence. Those skills serve us still in smaller battles for fairness and protection. The financial piece has long been settled, but its lessons linger. We've become vigilant about elder financial abuse, helping several families recognize warning signs. Michael serves on a non-profit board focused on elder rights. I donate jewelry pieces to fundraising auctions for domestic violence organizations. We use our resources, rebuilt after the legal battles, to support systems that protect the vulnerable. It's a way of honoring not just Sophie's survival, but all who weren't believed or saved in time. Thank you for reading our story. May it give you courage if you need it, wisdom if you're facing similar choices, and determination to always protect the vulnerable over the powerful. Sophie's bravery that night at the wedding started something bigger than any of us imagined. Let it continue with you, with all of us, choosing truth and protection and real love that doesn't enable abuse. That's how we change the world. One brave voice at a time, one family choosing differently, one child protected because someone listened and believed and acted. The freezer door closes on our story, but unlike that night, we're on the outside, free and safe and whole. Inside are only the memories we're transforming into purpose, the pain we're converting into protection for others. Sophie's voice, once meant to be silenced by cold and fear, now rings clear and strong. Listen to it. Believe it. Let it inspire you to examine your own life for places where silence enables harm. Then speak up, act up, stand up. That's what Sophie did, and look how far we've come. Imagine how far we can all go together, voices raised in truth, refusing to be frozen into silence anymore.